Good morning. Good to have everybody all back together, or most everybody. Now we got some other people traveling in different places, so today is our last lesson in this summer quarter about David and Solomon. If you haven't grabbed one of the new books, they're still back there, plenty back there. Starting next week, Lord willing, looking at the Godhead. Should be a very interesting study. But for now, we're in 2 Chronicles 9, looking at the last lesson about Solomon. The last several lessons have been about Solomon, but this is one last look at King Solomon from chapter 9, about his fame, which was quite a lot. We have to remember also that Solomon is the writer of the book of Ecclesiastes. And in Ecclesiastes, as difficult of a book as it is at times, and so much that some people don't really know what to do with it, Solomon admits that he pretty much tried everything that could be tried as far as coming up with what is life all about? What if there is a thing that we could say, this is what life is, or this is the purpose, or the best thing even. He tried it all. In chapter 1, verses 12 through 14, he said, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven, which is a euphemism for on earth. Under heaven, it means on earth. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after wind. It's a bold statement. He's already said it earlier in the book. That was verses 12 through 14. Even sooner than that, he makes his point very clear. All is vanity. Everything. And then he goes through lists. I did this. Vanity. So he already gives his conclusion at the beginning. Everything's vanity. So when I went and tried this, found out it was vanity. Got all the riches anybody could ever hope to accumulate. Vanity. All the wisdom. Vanity. Everything, he says, vanity. Pleasure, possessions, popularity. And then after he had all those things, he mentioned how he was, he says, I became great and surpassed all before me in Jerusalem, and also my wisdom remained with me. So of all the things that man might say life has to offer, Solomon had every single bit of it in excess. And he says, that was one of the reasons for his fame, by the way, but his conclusion is, all vanity. But he is a good person. He would be the one to know because he had it all. That's part of the old, the grass is always greener on the other side. I think every single human being struggles with that a little bit at least. Or sometimes it may not be the other side, but maybe back then, I think a lot of us struggle with that even more. Grass was greener back then. But we hang on to that as long as we don't have whatever's on that other side. But Solomon, being one who did have it, is qualified to say, I can tell you it's not greener. It's not any greener. And as difficult as we find that to believe, rich people say money doesn't bring happiness, and then we think, well, it's easy for you to say, you've actually got it. So I think it might actually bring some happiness because I don't have any. But Solomon, the book of Ecclesiastes, regardless of what interpretation we might take or what application we might make from it, the book's place in the canon of Scripture was inspired of the Holy Spirit. And the book itself was by the design of the Holy Spirit. And so we can trust Solomon's judgment, at least in that it's all vanity. Everything done under the sun is vanity. Not everything literally, but everything done under the sun. But because of all these things that Solomon had, his wisdom and his wealth and his execution of wisdom, he became famous. Very famous. All over the world, that part of the world. Says in 1 Kings 3:28, Solomon was known throughout Israel for his wise judgment, and says the people saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. But it went beyond the borders of Israel. Chapter 4, verses 29 and 30, 1 Kings 4 says, God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and breadth of mind like the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. We've talked about that in the past, how Egypt was known for their advancements in medical science and technology, though in hindsight, in retrospect, it wasn't wise at all, most of it. But not that all the things they did were all not very good, but some of their medical advancements were not advisable. But they had the reputation of being the wise people. They had this great wisdom. Remember when Jesus was, shortly after Jesus' birth, the wise men from the east came. That's significant. From the east, they had the wisdom. But Solomon's wisdom surpassed all of it, all of that. And because of that, verse 34 says, people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. But then there's his riches. 1 Kings 10:23, his riches surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches. 1 Kings 10:21 says, all King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None were of silver. Silver was not considered as anything in the days of Solomon. That's how prosperous the nation was during Solomon's reign from a financial standpoint, economical standpoint. Silver was counted as nothing. All his drinking vessels were of gold. Now, we might look at that and think, that's a little excessive, don't you think? I mean, no matter how rich you are, you got to drink out of gold too? I mean, come on. But if you got a surplus of gold, I mean, what? I mean, that's the point of this detail is even his drinking vessels were of gold. If they had indoor plumbing the way we have it, they might even say even his toilets were gold. That's how rich. That's how prosperous. Then in verse 27 it says, the king made silver, same thing as it said in verse 21. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone, and he made cedar as plentiful as the sycamore. So Jesus in Matthew 6 refers to Solomon as being arrayed in all his glory. This is the image that he's talking about. The way the Jews viewed Solomon, these descriptions, that's how they viewed Solomon. The kingdom, of course, David was the more military, he was more of a warrior, and that was his mindset, and that's how he began his reign, and he had to fight battles and extended the borders of the kingdom. Solomon did not extend the borders like David did. But David's administration and the nation under David did not enjoy this kind of glory, if we want to call it that. That was under Solomon's reign. So Solomon had the reputation among the Jews that was Solomon and everything that Solomon stood for. The temple, Solomon's temple, made silver as common as stone. Everything was gold, and they longed for that. You could almost say lusted after that, a restoration of that. So when Jesus refers to Solomon and all his glory, and then makes the point, among others, that God arrayed even the lilies of the field greater than he arrayed Solomon. That would have meant something to them. So our lesson text here in 2 Chronicles 9 describes some of the fame of Solomon in considerable detail, known far and wide. But one of the quotes that we have that we attribute to Solomon that is he's probably most known for is the end of Ecclesiastes. It says, "The end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man," or the whole of man. "For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil." So, after having gone through and saying that every single thing under the sun is vanity, the book ends by saying, here's the end of the matter, the real end. Fear God and keep His commandments. Everything out under the sun is vanity. So fear God and keep His commandments. The tragedy in Solomon's life is that he didn't seem to apply the wisdom that God gave him in his own life. And the book, shockingly, our book that is, leaves most of that out, if not all of it. But we've already made references to it, and we'll probably point it out again because it is significant and there are less sobering lessons to be learned from Solomon's life. We have to remember that 1 Kings tells us that Solomon strayed from God when he was old. It's not wise to ever stray from God, but the least wise time to do it is when you're old. A lot of people do it when they're young. That's not smart either. But as a rule, time at least is on their side, maybe. But when you do it at the end of your life, which also happens to be around the time, that phase of his life that he wrote Ecclesiastes, there are powerful lessons to be learned from how we utilize the wisdom that God can provide us. But first, let's look at the text here. 2 Chronicles 9. The Queen of Sheba comes to visit. Now we have to remember that Israel was a very small place, about the size, geographically speaking, about the size of New Jersey, if that means anything to you. Some people I know that won't mean anything to, won't name names, but that's about the size. If you look at a map of America, New Jersey, it's not a big state. Israel, right there in the middle of the Middle East pretty much, it was insignificant, generally, and up to that point, it was not a superpower. But here is the Queen of Sheba, regardless of how much power Sheba had, wherever this was, and whatever role they played in the ancient world, it's still significant that the queen of that place would come to see Solomon in this Israel place. But it says, when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, she came to Jerusalem to test him with hard questions. Having a very great retinue and camels bearing spices, and very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she told him all that was on her mind. Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing hidden from Solomon that he couldn't explain to her. So she's coming, testing him. Let's see how wise he really is. Enough talk. I'm going to go and I'll test him. I'm going to put him to the test. Apparently that test didn't last too long. And then she's telling him everything that's on her mind, like everything that she can think of, whatever it is, he's got an answer for all of it. So not just whatever kinds of testing hard questions she had, But even maybe moral things, ethical things, things of principle, matters of judgment and things, Solomon he had answers. Everything. So she was impressed. It says, when the Queen of Sheba had seen the wisdom of Solomon and the house that he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his officials, and the attendance of his servants and their clothing, his cupbearers and their clothing, and his burnt offerings that he offered at the house of Jehovah, there was no more breath in her. Not literally. She didn't die. Took her breath away. She was in awe. And she said, the report was true that I heard in my own land of your words and your wisdom. I didn't believe the reports until I came and my own eyes had seen it. And behold, the half the greatness of your wisdom wasn't told to me. You surpassed the report that I heard. Happy are your men. ESV says wives there. Didn't ever come to find an answer for that disparity. Happy are these your servants who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Blessed be Jehovah your God, who has delighted in you and set you on his throne as king for Jehovah your God. Because your God loved Israel and would establish them forever, he has made you king over them, that you may execute justice and righteousness. We'll just stop there because that's leading into the next part anyway. But she sees not just his wisdom, she sees everything his royal court, food on his table. And remember, she was a queen. So by our standard, her table was probably pretty abundant and plentiful and luxurious on a daily basis. But she saw his, and the significant thing here is that she made the connection between all of this and his God. God was the one who is responsible for all this. His God. And she gave him more gifts. The last thing Solomon needs is more gifts. I see all that you have, and you've got way more than I was even told about. So here, have some more. But it says, yeah, somebody have something?
The fact that she traveled 1,200 miles when she heard of him and his judgment, she wanted to find out more. The whole purpose of Exhibit Evangelism is finding the few who traveled to the fair to learn. And even greater are all the families that spend the money and sacrifice the time to go to polishing the pulpit to hear the Word of God from men who have studied it for many years. Mm-hmm. If you want to find God, he can be found. You have to seek him. But if you don't want to seek him, he's not going to find you.
Yep, so we got to give her credit. She came. Now, we don't know how this changed her life, from this point on. It may not have had any effect on her daily life from this point, other than thinking, man, I kind of wish I was the Queen of Israel, because I kind of like some of that. But we don't really know. We're not told. But we are told that she attributed it to Solomon's God and his love for his people. The reason that he made you king, the reason that you're king over this people is because of how much God loves these people. That's a big compliment. That you are king over this people. That's evidence that God really loves these people. Your God really loves these people. That's why he did it. He did it for them. Everybody here is blessed. Then she gave them 120 talents of gold and a very great quantity of spices. What else? Precious stones. There were no spices such as those that the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. next 3 verses tell us about more stuff that Hiram, you remember Hiram from Tyre? More gifts. The richer you are, the more free stuff you get. There never was seen the like of them before in the land of Judah. The things that he had. Lyres, harps, singers. He used the algum wood from Tyre, from Hiram, to build supports. That's what the ESV says for the house of Jehovah, the temple. Everything that there was there never before had been seen in Judah, and never would after either, to this day. But we can't lose sight of where it all came from. It didn't just come from Hiram, and it didn't just come from the Queen of Sheba. Those were, I would argue, those are not things that Solomon obtained in addition to what God gave him. That was included in what God gave him, providentially. Queen of Sheba coming from 1,000 miles away, bringing all this stuff. I think God probably had something to do with that. And especially if we think about what she may have taken back with her as far as what she had learned, how impressed she was with the people of this God Jehovah, that she doesn't even know who it is. And then we read more about Solomon's wealth. This is his annual income. 666 talents of gold per year. Now that may not mean anything to you, doesn't mean anything to me, other than that's a lot. I don't even know how much it is. I don't know it's a lot. Footnote in the ESV says a talent was about 75 pounds or 34 kilograms. That's 1 talent. And if that's correct, accurate, I'm not even going to try to do the math. But for 1 year's income, that's unheard of. And then it says, verse 14, besides that which the explorers and merchants brought. And all the kings of Arabia and the governors of the land brought gold and silver to Solomon. King Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold. 600 shekels of beaten gold went into each shield. Again, the footnote says a shekel is about 11 grams, 2/5 of an ounce. Each shield, 600 shekels of gold into each shield. Even your shields are going to be gold. The things that are literally designed to get beaten up with weapons, if they're actually going to be used, that is. Of course, in Solomon's day, they didn't have to be, but it was all just this is the image of what greatness is to the Jews, anyway. Did you have something, or were you just stretching?
Kind of.
Okay.
I just thought it was kind of ironic how they used gold, which is the softest metal, for shields. Unless it was for decorative shields to put around, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, like we said, at least in Solomon's reign, they weren't going to need to be used. But it's just a flex, I think.
Yeah.
Look, my cups are gold. Shields are gold. Everything's gold.
I think they would have been kind of intimidating to walk into a place like that.
Yeah.
He's got this much gold. What kind of army does he have backing him? Kind of thing.
Yeah. All came from God, more or less. He made a great ivory throne, which he then overlaid with pure gold. had 6 steps. The footstool was gold. Each side of the seat were armrests and 2 lions standing beside the armrests, while 12 lions stood there, one on each end of a step on the 6 steps. Nothing like it was ever made for any kingdom. That's kind of the point, probably. I mean, another king in the whole world has got a throne like that. Can't help but wonder, though, if these lions would qualify as some of the things that God told them not to fashion. Graven images, it's pretty much right on the nose of what that is. Again, we read King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold. The vessels, we already read that, already mentioned that earlier, of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Silver wasn't considered anything. It says the king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the ships of Tarshish were used to come bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. Or baboons, your Bible might say. Just shows you how tricky some of the Hebrew words can be. Well, this word either means peacock or baboon. Thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. And all the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. Where did all this wisdom come from? Well, in case we forgot, the wisdom that all the kings of the earth came to hear had been put into his mind by God. Now, any small measure of wisdom that any of us have ultimately has come from God. But you know what? Just because we have some measure of wisdom, even godly wisdom, does not always translate into godly living, does it? Even when God somehow, one way or another, directly puts that wisdom into your mind, which He doesn't do for everybody. He doesn't do that for really anybody, but He did it for Solomon. Maybe directly is the wrong word, but He answered his prayer and said, I'm going to give you the wisdom that you've asked for.
But He also still had free will.
Yeah, but what God did not give Solomon is immunity to stupidity. He did not grant him the ability or the inability to make wrong choices. All the wisdom in the world does not cure you of your ability to make mistakes. That leads us, verse 24 then, even further, every one of them brought his present. You didn't come to Solomon without a present. You know, some people are hard to shop for. It's like, what in the world? I don't know what to get you. Think about Solomon. It's like, we got to bring something. We don't want to look dumb. Some of these other people probably brought him something really special. What can I bring him? But everybody brought something. Year by year, gold, garments, myrrh, spices, horses, mules. All the time, year by year. But then we read, Solomon had 4,000 stalls for horses and chariots and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. Deuteronomy chapter 17. Verse 16. The subheading in my Bible says, Laws concerning Israel's kings. Now this is before they ever had a king, but it anticipated that they eventually would. Here are some laws that God gave concerning Israel's kings. Here's one of them in Deuteronomy 17:16. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since Jehovah has said to you, you shall never return that way again. Well, we don't necessarily get the impression from 2 Chronicles 9 that Solomon was making a great effort, at least from the verse we just read. But verse 28 says, horses were imported for Solomon from Egypt and from all lands. Well, how do you import horses from Egypt to a place that's not in Egypt? How do the horses get to you?
Pay money for it and people bring them to you.
Okay,
Or he may have sent his own people.
exactly. It's got to be one of the two. Either you got to send somebody there, at least to tell them the message, because they couldn't get a message to them any other way. Can't put an order in over the internet, By the way, I could use some horses. 2-day shipping, please. No, you got to send somebody there. Well, that's exactly the exact thing that God said he should not do. He must not acquire many horses or send people to Egypt to get horses. Egypt was known for their horses, just like Lebanon was known for its wood. Egypt was the horse people. We've got the best horses. You want wood, you go to Lebanon. You want horses, you go to Egypt. Solomon imported horses from Egypt. So he not only multiplied horses to himself, he multiplied them from Egypt, which would have included sending people to Egypt. Verse 17 then, although our text, 2 Chronicles 9, doesn't talk about it, let's see. Verse 17 of Deuteronomy 17 says, and he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. Okay, somebody might say, well, didn't we just make the point so many times that God gave him it? God gave him that wealth? Yes. But we also learn that Solomon got a considerable amount for himself. He got some for himself, and a lot of it came from the people of Israel. But one thing that Solomon is infamous for is his women, his wives. So again, Deuteronomy 17:17, he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Well, 2 Chronicles 9 doesn't deal with very much more of Solomon's life. The rest of the chapter says that the rest of the acts of Solomon are written in the history of Nathan the prophet, and in the prophecy of Ahijah the Shilonite, and in the visions of Iddo the seer, all of which are no longer in existence, as far as we know. Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years, and then he slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, and his son Rehoboam reigned in his place. But in Kings, we learn a little bit more that could fit right into 2 Chronicles 9, right after verse 28, and talk about, I think it's 1 Kings 11 maybe? 1 Kings 10 is the equivalent of 2 Chronicles 9, okay? 1 Kings 10? Well, 1 Kings 11 starts like this. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which Jehovah had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart. Well, shocker. Now, the rule of Bible interpretation is you take something literal unless there is a contextual indicator not to. I think an argument could be made either way in this case, but to me, it seems pretty literal. So, it's not, when we think about 700 wives, I can't even keep one happy. How in the world can I have 700? Yeah, we have no clue what their dynamic was. He may not have even talked to them, even on a monthly basis. How could he? Well, let's see, we got 365 days in the year. I can almost talk to all of my wives once a day for 2 years. In 2 years, I'll pretty much be able to talk to every one of them at least once a day. So every day of the year, I've got a wife for almost 2 years. Yes, sir. Yeah. He seems to have gotten used to that. It's almost like he didn't even have to take it because it was there, like given to him. So with the fame of Solomon, we read in 2 Chronicles and the reference in 1 Kings 10, 2 Chronicles 9, people were coming to him from all over to hear his wisdom, to see. But that what is not mentioned that clearly seems to have been the case was there were also people that would come and want to be a part of that. What better way to be a part of it than, hey, I've got a young virgin daughter. Want her? Sure. I'll call her 672. She'll be number 672. Just makes it easier to keep up with them. So, whenever Solomon was this famous and renowned in the ancient world, it's not that unthinkable to imagine all kinds of powerful people, men, wanting to join with that. And that's the way they did things back then. King, you got a daughter, I got a son. Let's join our houses. And that exact principle is the very thing that God said, don't do. So he's joining. We've never seen the nation of Israel more involved with the pagan world than in Solomon's reign. Now the Jews seemingly totally overlooked all of that, and they just held Solomon in unadulterated glory and esteem. Solomon was right up there with David. The Scriptures, however, do not cast him in that light. Because 1 Kings 11, I mentioned how 1 Kings 10 is the equivalent of 2 Chronicles 9. Well, 2 Chronicles 10, Solomon's already dead, and Rehoboam has taken his place. But 1 Kings 11 tells us about, essentially, the very last thing about Solomon was a reminder or a reference to the fact that he married all these women that did exactly what God warned they would do. They turned his heart. So verse 4 says, when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods. And his heart was not wholly true to Jehovah his God, as was the heart of his father David, of David his father. Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of Jehovah, and did not wholly follow Jehovah, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. And so he did for all his foreign wives, who made offerings and sacrifices to their gods.
So he made basically shrines for all these different gods.
Yeah, he enabled the worship, the continual worship of the gods of his wives. He could have I guess, God gave him all the wisdom that there is to be in the world. You would think maybe he could have striven to convert some of his wives. Yeah. If you're going to be my wife, join to my house, you will have to abandon these gods. Still would have been against God's command, but it would have been something at least. But instead of that, he actually enabled them, encouraged them, made it so that they could continue, gave them a place to worship their false gods. One of which, if you noticed, Molech. Molech was a very notorious false god in the ancient world and in the context of the Old Testament, because he was the one that desired, didn't exist, so he didn't really desire anything, but the lore around him was children. Child sacrifice. So Solomon, he built a high place for Molech, knowing full well what that high place was going to be used for. When he was old. And verse 9 says, Jehovah was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from Jehovah, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing that he should not go after other gods. But he didn't keep what Jehovah commanded. Therefore Jehovah said to Solomon, since this has been your practice and you've not kept my covenant, my statutes that I've commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant, just like he did with Saul. But let this be a solemn warning to us that all the wisdom in the world doesn't mean obedience or being right with God. It's not enough to gain wisdom. You have to know what to do with it. You have to use it. You have to do the thing that you know is right to do. So knowing what is right and what is wrong is a huge step in the right direction, because if you don't know what's right and what's wrong, you can't really ever do right, because even when you do it, it was an accident, But when you know what's right and wrong, that's the first step. But knowing what's right versus what's wrong doesn't make you do the thing that's right. Solomon failed. Yeah.
Right, it doesn't matter how much good you did in your life, you could have done everything good, but before you die, if you have turned away from God, all of that other equals nothing.
Yep. So, everything that Solomon, all the good he did, all the wisdom he had, we get the impression that this wasn't just a thing that happened right at the end, but at least it was in the latter phase of his life that he threw it all away. Even if he hadn't been throwing it away over his entire life, at the end, near the end at least, he threw it all away. And, the end of chapter 11 is, 1 Kings 11 is the end of Solomon's portion. Never is there ever a mention of him repenting. Even after God told him, I'm tearing it away from you, tearing the kingdom away from you. But not all of it. For the sake of your father, I'm going to let your son keep half, he'll have half of it. But the kingdom was torn in half. Solomon, this would have been the time to see a repentance. But again, he wrote Ecclesiastes, probably seems to have been before this, which is sad. So even with that statement that he's known for so well about, here's the end of the matter, fear God and keep His commandments, we see at the end of his own life he didn't do that. Well, I wasted all our time to do the applications, but Solomon was great in a lot of ways, in the minds of the Jews especially, but Jesus was greater. He is greater, and Jesus himself made that point. And The meaning of life is not to be found in your net worth or the things you have. Jesus made that point too. Life is more than your stuff, to paraphrase what Jesus said loosely. Yes, sir. Yep. Yeah, if anything, Solomon had the least excuse of anybody to have done what he did, because of God will look at him and say, what about all that wisdom I gave you? You know, what happened to that? Jesus treated people that he knew better. He treated them more harshly than he did other people. So Solomon knew better, and he didn't act better. We can do the same thing, but we need to avoid it.